This program is not brought to you by viewers like you, because none of you subscribe to my Patreon. I'm almost finished with my documentary on the life of the extraordinary Oscar Charleston. I'll have that uploaded soon. While making a lot of my documentaries, I have conversations with experts that may stray from the specific focus of the documentary, but are fascinating nonetheless, and I still want to share those DVD extras. In this case, I visited the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and spoke with the museum president, Bob Kendrick. The next time you're in Kansas City, Missouri, you should definitely visit the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. Please subscribe and keep an eye out for my documentary on Oscar Charleston. In the meantime, please enjoy this video and take a look at the other titles on my channel.
So yeah, but not many of those places where Negro Leagues baseball was held still exist. In the Negro Leagues, I remember talking to Henry Aaron, who left Mobile, Alabama to go join the Indianapolis Clowns in 1952, and he told me, he says, "Bob, I didn't know if I was leaving home to go play with kids my own age or grown men." And of course, he was leaving to go play with grown men. He, like Oscar Charleston, both acquitted themselves very well, and they could hold their own under any circumstances, and Charleston certainly did that. It was a tough game, and I think it was Roy Campanella said, "It's a game for kids, but you got to be a man to play it." Because, and in the Negro Leagues, that was even magnified because not only are you talking about a very aggressive style of play that was pretty much an innate part of how the game was played in the Negro Leagues, but then you're adding the dimension of what Jim Crow and life during Jim Crow on top of that. So no, you had to be tough to survive in the Negro Leagues. It was not for the faint of heart. And Oscar Charleston had that persona. He had the intestinal fortitude that allowed him to excel.
Okay, so the ABCs weren't a part of the league? They hadn't started yet?
Not when the ABCs initially started. They became one of the original 8 Negro League franchises. When the leagues were established, of course, that meeting took place here in Kansas City on February 13, 1920. The newly formed Negro National League had been established, led by Andrew Roop Foster, who had 7 other independent black baseball team owners. They met at the Paseo YMCA. The building is just right around the corner from where the museum operates. As a matter of fact, we now own that historic landmark and are working to convert it into the Buckle Neal Education and Research Center. So we're going to go full circle right back to the very building that gave birth to the story that we're now charged with preserving. But that is where the meeting took place. They signed the documents, started the Negro National League. The Negro Leagues, of course, would go on to operate amazingly for 40 years, from 1920 until 1960. There's still Negro League players still alive. Most of them, as we've kind of recognized them, are the young Negro Leaguers. They are the ones who played well after integration. They played at the very tail end of the Negro Leagues in the 50s and up to 1960 when the league ceased operations. And so there's still some around. We guesstimate about 100 or so, give or take. Every now and then a player passes on that we don't know about because we're not always informed of these passings. And then every now and then a player surfaces that we didn't know was still alive. And so it's not an easy task tracking the actual number of players who are still there, because there were guys who, as we sometimes describe them, were cup of coffee guys. They may have played 1 or 2 games, but they played. So they're still part of what was the Negro Leagues. No, it was later. The ABCs probably come into existence in the early 1900s, maybe close to the mid 1900s. But black folks' involvement in our game can honestly be traced all the way back to slavery, of us playing some form of what would be considered baseball. And of course, in the late 1800s, around 1883 or so, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was a dark-skinned black man, played on what would be considered a major league team. We've since discovered that there was a player by the name of William Edward White, who played one game prior to Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was indeed black, but William Edward White either passed as white or thought he was white because his father was white. And it was later discovered that he was indeed the byproduct of an affair that his father had with one of the slaves, thus making him black. And so he plays one game, but Moses Fleetwood Walker was of darker skin. There was no denying his ethnicity. He was a bare-handed catcher. And guys like Adrian Cap Anson and others formed, quote-unquote, a gentleman's agreement that would ultimately ban blacks from playing on white major league teams for the next 6 decades before Jackie Robinson would essentially re-break the color barrier on April 15, 1947. Moses Fleetwood Walker was a bare-handed catcher. Didn't last long because Anson and others formed that gentleman's agreement, and basically they were saying, well, we're doing this for his own good. We don't want anything to happen. And the sentiment was, if you allow black to play with you, you can't play with us. And Anson had that level of influence. He was a great baseball player. He is enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. So he had the influence to bring others along with him. So he built a coalition of followers who shared that same sentiment that would keep blacks out of Major League Baseball again for the next six decades until Jackie Robinson re-breaks the color barrier. But amazingly, there was no written doctrine. This was just a verbalized agreement amongst players, managers, and owners. And the major league owners upheld this gentleman's agreement up until Jackie is plucked away from the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945. Of course, 2 years later, he would take the field as a member of the Brooklyn Dodgers, forever changing the game of baseball, but more importantly, forever changing this country. Well, you know, with Willie Mays, and people sometimes forget, we get lost in his superior athletic ability, that we don't always give those great athletes the credit that they deserve for their cerebral aspect, their knowledge of the game. Willie Mays was as smart a ball player as you will ever see. A lot of people thought he was making the basket catch because he was showboating. Well, for him, he would tell you he made the basket catch because it was easier for him to transfer the ball from here to his throwing arm, much easier than it was to go up here and bring it down to transfer, which is why he made the basket catch. Now, everybody couldn't do that. Everybody's just not that adept and not that skilled as Willie Mays, and he always made it look so easy. Yeah, he made it look so easy, and so sometimes people would be critical, and that was the case when Major League Baseball players assessed the Negro Leagues anyway. They would always accuse the Negro Leaguers of showboating. But as my friend, the late, great Buck O'Neill would say, number one, if you got something to show, show it. Number two, it's only showboating when you can't do it. And so it was always this perception that the players in the Negro Leagues didn't play the game the right way. In essence, what they were saying is the players in the Negro Leagues didn't play the game the white way. Yeah, and it was polar difference, you know, in how they played the game. Major League Baseball back then was essentially a base-to-base kind of game. Guy got on base, you moved him over to second, and then the big hitters came up and drove him in. The Negro Leagues didn't play the game quite that way. No, man, they would drop that bunt, they would steal second, they steal third, and if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And honestly, it was a far more exciting brand of baseball in comparison to the style that was being played in Major League Baseball, which is why you saw such a tremendous fan base coming out to watch Negro League games, and a large percentage of that fan base was white. Yeah, because they were watching what many would say the best baseball being played in this country, without question the most entertaining brand of baseball that was being played in this country. Yeah, no, as Buck O'Neill would say, you couldn't go to the concession stand because you might miss something that you ain't never seen before. Yeah, no, so it was different. It was different.
Because those characteristics sound like what I understand like the 60s to be in Major
Yep,
League Baseball.
that's exactly what it was. So with integration, as Negro League stars transitioned to Major League Baseball, the pace of the game picked up with it. Man, you got all these great athletes coming into your fold now, both black and brown. And they brought that level. Jackie brought the style that he had seen being played in the Negro Leagues. He's a sensational athlete. He comes in, he's bunting, he's stealing bases, he's driving pitchers crazy, you know, jumping off and darting off the bases, and you had to put your attention on him. I think he stole home some 19 times during his career, and you stop to think about it, he only played for about 10 years. And he stole home 19 times. You know, but that was the Negro League style of play. And you saw this particularly in the National League because the National League was far more aggressive signing this black talent than the American League was. The American League was very slow. They didn't really want to do it. And I think they passed up on great stars because maybe in their own way they were trying to prove a point that the black player wasn't good enough to play in their league. Meanwhile, the National League, they're going out trying to get the very best that they could pluck away from the Negro Leagues. From 1949 through 1959, 9 of 11 National League most valuable players were former Negro League stars. We're not even talking rookies of the year. These are MVPs. Yeah, and then the National League started dominating the All-Star games and World Series because they were just far more aggressive. I remember the late, great Bob Gibson. He once said that the black players looked at the American League, they thought it was a place where old ball players went to die.
That's how my dad characterized it. He said he was a kid that was, if you weren't good enough for the National League yet, or if
then you go over to the American League. Yeah, you can finish up your career in the American League.
So how could such a remarkable player sort of be on top 10 lists, but a name people don't recognize?
That's the plight of the Negro Leagues. Yeah, that's the plight of the Negro Leagues. And that's why a Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is so important, so that they who seemingly toiled in anonymity from a mainstream perspective anyway for so long can finally be paid the proper respect that they certainly earn for what they gave this game. And Oscar Charleston is, as you mentioned, one of the top 10 baseball players of all time. There are those who believe he was the greatest baseball player of all time. My good friend Joe Posnanski has him ranked in his top 5 players of all time in the Baseball 100. So you see these different perspectives and purviews on Charleston and just how much respect he has garnered through the world of researchers, educators, authors who've gone deeper to learn more about a player of the magnitude of Oscar Charleston. But he hasn't gotten the mainstream credit that he so sorely deserves. This museum is trying to help make that happen, as we do with all the legends of the Negro Leagues, and make sure that people, when they talk about the great players of all time, that these players are included in those conversations. Oscar Charleston could hold his own with anyone who ever played this game.
You know what kind of drove him? Was it social justice, or did he just kind of see it as like a continuation of his farm system? Or?
You know, that is the age-old question of what was really Branch Rickey's motivation. I certainly believe that Branch Rickey was a righteous man because it took a lot of guts to do what he ultimately did, and that was bring a black man into Major League Baseball to integrate the game, because you knew that you were going to be ostracized by your peers. They were going to essentially stand in solidarity to try and prevent this, and he essentially outsmarted them. But Branch Rickey also had somewhat of a diabolical plan to, I won't say to destroy, the Negro Leagues, but he certainly had planned to raid the Negro Leagues of its talent without compensation to its owners. So contrary to popular belief, Branch Rickey did not sign Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. He took Jackie Robinson away from the Kansas City Monarchs. And James Leslie Wilkinson, who was the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, never got paid for Jackie Robinson. But James Leslie Wilkinson was in no position to fight back because Wilkie was white. And I think Rickey knew that this white man could not be the public face of blocking what every black person in America had been waiting for a black man to play in the major leagues. If this white man who made his living in black baseball is that public face, that black fan base that had been so loyal to him, they would have turned their backs on him right away. And I think Rickey knew that. He was shrewd enough to know that. I think he was calculating enough to bank on that. And so publicly, Wilkie said all the right things because he has to protect his business interests. This was his livelihood. He'd made his entire living in black baseball. So he has to say the right things to protect that business. Privately, he is seething. And as I tell our guests here at the museum, he's not seething necessarily because a black man is about to play in the major leagues, but this black man that you're going to take away from me, you're going to put me out of business. And he was right. He sold his business interest to his partner, T.Y. Baird, in 1948, the year after Jackie takes the field, because at that point, the handwriting is on the wall. It's not a matter of if the Negro Leagues are going to fold. It's simply a matter of when the Negro Leagues were going to fold. And Wilkie knew that it was time for him to bow out gracefully, and that's exactly what he does. And so, as I tell folks all the time, Rickey is somewhere between a saint and a devil, but aren't we all?
And I saw a story about Jesse Owens in Charleston. Can you talk about that?
Now, you know, I know that Jesse Owens, because Jesse Owens was a frequent focal point at a lot of Negro League games, you know, and so Jesse spent a lot of time in and around Negro League players. I know that he and Charleston had a relationship, but I don't know exactly how close their relationship was. But again, great athletes appreciate great athletes, so it's no surprise that Owens and Charleston would have been connected in some way, just as Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson were friends. You know, greatness seems to draw and attract greatness. And so, but Jesse was very close to the Negro Leagues. Jesse would eventually be part owner of a Negro Leagues franchise in a failed effort out west, had the Portland Rosebuds. Team didn't succeed, the league didn't succeed, it was very short-lived. So Jesse was always in and around those Negro League players, and of course the legend has it that he refused to race the legendary James Thomas Cool Papa Bell, who was also a teammate of Oscar Charleston at one point in time. Just flat out refused to race him. Cool Papa Bell is still believed to be the fastest man to ever play this game. Jesse Owens would race horses around the bases, but apparently would never race Cool Papa Bell, and Cool Papa Bell would challenge him to a race, and Jesse Owens would say, well, I don't have my track shoes. Cool Papa Bell looks at him and says, I don't have my track shoes either. Let's get it on. And Jesse wanted no part of that.